Okay. So, colleagues, I mean, first of all, it's um, it's a distinct pleasure, I would say, to be here in our, first joint seminar. Um, and well, so far it was fascinating. So I hope that the next session will be, closing session actually will be equally great. If first two sessions were devoted most for the most part to kind of theoretical issues and Soviet Union type of better state. Now we move to other parts of the world. So it's my pleasure to give floor to Ayansina Ayanlade, who will talk on Central Africa about oil, climate, and gender in there. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I know sometimes it's usually tricky to. Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, I'm trying to put it in. Okay, I think it's a better mode now.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's usually tricky after lunch to to do presentation. I hope you'll be able to follow me along. The title is a little bit broad, but I will try to do my best to narrow it down and to move through the presentation. And afterward, we will be able to give discussion. Oil, climate, and gender issue in Africa. My name is Ayansina Ayanlade. I know it's a very long name. You can just call me Shina, the one I underlined there. So it will make it easy for you. I'm based in CEU, a postdoc under ALES in the Open Society Hub. For the presentation today, I grouped this into just 3 or 4 sections, in order to be having a kind of coherent presentation. The code we have there is just to link to, if you want, you can scan it and to link to some of the work I've done in the past that actually inform part of what I'm presenting today. So for the presentation today, I will say a little bit about what I'm doing currently in research group as a postdoc, and it's not a final thing, but just to present here and also have your input and advice. And I will look at that in the aspect of Africa generally, in terms of climate change in Africa and what is going on there. But before this, the most important aspect is African and global oil exploitation, and then climate change in Africa, what we've known so far in terms of oil exploration in Africa, and what is already there in the research, especially what I've done also in my own research relating to climate change in Africa. But I will round off this presentation looking at what we are yet to know. So globally, when you look at Africa, Africa is a very big continent in terms of size and in terms of population. But what is actually interesting when you look at the map before you is that almost all the country that you have in Africa, there's mining of exploration going on there. Some are just ongoing that are not yet being produced, and some have been producing for long period of time, even some over 60 years. The interesting part of it is that about 10% of the crude oil from Africa are actually produce crude, and 10% African contribute about 10% into the global crude oil market. And about 75% of this crude oil, oil that are being produced in Africa, are actually export in crude to global market or to other parts of the world, where they will refine this and send it back to Africa. And we know the implication of that on the economy of Africa. When you have something, material being produced from you, and they get it in crude and refine it somewhere else and bring it to the country again, to be the country will buy it. And this is making many of the currency of African to be actually affected, and in terms of the performance. So looking at this figure before you, what I've been doing so far in my research here is to look at, okay, within Africa, which country are the leading petrol state in Africa? And I use the data from UN and also the data from different sources, and we're able to see up to the current data, up to 2023, that when you look at the map, the leading country in terms of the first 10 are Nigeria, Algeria, Libya, Angola, Egypt, and Congo. Others too, they produce certain quantity, but not as much as those are mentioned. So this actually informed what I'm doing currently in my research, to be able to look at, okay, how many of these countries are actually located in sub-Saharan Africa? So I want to look at, okay, those that are in sub-Saharan Africa and those that are also in the north that call themselves Arab country like Egypt and so on, and compare the performance in terms of their oil production, and also look at how this influence the economic state. And also there's new aspect to my study, looking at how this also influence the gender inequality in this part of the world. And I will get to that level, and there are a series of questions that has been going on in my mind that I will also put to the table for better discussion hereafter. But generally, when we look at the literature, we see that what we have there is all about, things about oil exploration in Africa. There you will see the issue of oil crisis, oil conflict, oil-driven conflict, and so on. Many of them are actually focusing on how oil bring about human rights violation in Africa. And the disturbance of ecosystem is one of the key things you will find in the literature when you are talking about oil exploration in Africa. And so many publications on how oil have been affecting ecosystem, which is actually important. And that aspect of eco-genocide is being mentioned in many of the literatures. And also, one of the main issues that you also find in the literature is the aspect of genocide, how oil leads to genocide in Africa. Well, these are very good. So many of these good, this publication are very good, giving us better understanding on how oil resources actually scattered across the whole continent, and how this oil wealth can also trigger genocide, ecocide, and inequality in the continent. But the other part that you will also find, main point we also find in the literature, is that non-oil sector have been affected, and they are now actually performing well in global market, especially those that are from Africa, because majority of all these petrol state countries actually base their source of income, source of revenue from the oil. but the environmental implication and societal implication is very much. And what actually we see in the literature is the issue of ecocide and genocide. All right, but let me narrow it down a little bit and let's look at what we have, especially in Nigeria. Because when you look at the chart in the last slide, Nigeria led the table in terms of production. And in Nigeria, we can see from the economic perspective that the larger percentage of income actually comes currently from oil. And oil has been mined for a long period of time in Nigeria, but many of these will be gotten in crude and exported to other parts of the world in form of crude oil. Long time ago, there are two major refineries in the country that have been so good, but for the past 30 years, majority of these, all these refineries are no more working. Therefore, there's all the oil being mined in Nigeria being export crude to other parts of the world, and they will now sell the final product to the country. And this is making the currency of the country to perform very, very low in the global market. And when you look at the image beside you in 1960, Nigeria Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa was showing there. I'm very happy to see how oil is being performed, but like other presentation we had at the beginning of this workshop, the thing is that since 1960 up to now, what can we say about how oil actually contributes to the social and economic development in the country? It's a big debate that is actually going on in the whole country. But one thing we also need to know that colonial administration and oil workers use so many means to be able to sure that oil are being exported in crude ways back to other parts of the world. And all this contribute to less development we can also even see in the region where this oil has been mined in Nigeria. And the major region where you have oil mining in Nigeria is called Niger Delta. And you can see that even within Niger Delta in Nigeria alone, the delta called Niger Delta is, if I'm not mistaken, the largest delta in the whole Africa, which is very, very unique in terms of ecosystem. And the people that are staying there, majority of these people are indigenous. And the oil mining started there. Currently, we have about over 600 oil fields in this location alone, with over 300 of them on shore. And the implication of that on both marine and land ecosystem is very huge. And we will see this in literature. So many literature pointing this out, how the oil affects ecosystem, leading to what we call ecocide. But not only in terms of the implication on ecosystem, but what of the implication of oil mining on all other systems? When you look at the chart here, the data is actually from Nigeria Bureau of Statistics, and the data, I got it for this year. Well, you will see that in terms of the performance, non-oil sector in the country are not performing well compared to oil sector. Where you have the top greens and yellow, that is oil export in terms of crude, both in annual and monthly figure. But when you look at other sectors like agriculture, they are not really performing well. And why? Because they are not actually encouraged. There's no fund from the budget of the country to support non-oil sector. This is not actually the case and only in Nigeria. Part of what I'm trying to do currently is to see how also interplay in other country in sub-Saharan Africa. And from this chart too, you will see it very clearly that on top there, you see that oil exploration actually is leading, while the non-oil is not really having full support in terms or full performance in terms of the economic growth in the country. And this has general impact on the aspect of even gender, which we will talk about later. I read this book recently, which actually prompted my mind, and I've been like to also showcase this book, which look at oil that we thought it was oil, but it was blood. And this book actually concerns and focusing much like what you have even in the Michael Rose book. But the book here that we can see is actually focused on the issue in the Niger Delta in Nigeria, especially in the community called Odi, where there are a series of ecocide, the oil company that are mining oil there, you know, as a result of oil spillages and other activities, so many biodiversity loss has happened and so many impact on ecosystem. And Bassi's argument in this book is the fact that, look, who is going to take responsibility? And he started thinking about this because of what happened in OD community in November 1999. And what happened was that the community were asking the oil company that they need to take responsibility. They need to clean up their mess as a result of oil exploration. But in between the company and the government, who is going to take the responsibility? So the community are in between the company, oil companies, and also in between the government. When they meet with a company, the company will say, no, go and talk to your government. We deal with the government. And when they talk with the government will say, no, those that are polluting are the oil companies that are working there in your community. As a result, the people in the community could not keep silence. This generated to crisis, and it leads to massacre to the extent that the whole community were burned down and several people died. But you know, the interesting part of it, up to today, nobody knows exact number of the people that died in that community. And I want to also put to the table that the series of oil exploration, oil spillages that has been occurring in Niger Delta is being merged. I usually use this scenario of what happened, I think that should be 2010, when I was doing my PhD, that there was this oil spillages in US in one area. And the whole international news picked the whole story, and they were really talking about it for the whole 2-3 weeks. And I was just imagining that, look, several of this is happening in many parts of the world, other parts of the world in Global South, in Africa, in Niger Delta, that they are not actually in the international news. And this is one aspect of the issue we need to also think about when we are talking about decarbonization. How do we project this even in the news? How do they see the result compared to Global South, or if you permit me to use that term, and the Global North? Here, the picture you can see here is the picture of oil spillages affecting the whole ecosystem in the Niger Delta, even including marine ecosystem. The implication of this is not only end with ecosystem, but what of the people that are living in this community? The impact of oil exploration in this community is, especially when you have oil spillage, it means that it will affect the land. And many of these people, they are agrarian society who depend on agriculture for their livelihood. Majority of these people, especially living in the riverine area of Niger Delta, they depend on water. Fishery is their source of income. And when you have this type of impact, it affects their livelihood. And when the livelihood is affected, the whole community will be affected. Family life will also be affected. I like this because part of what I did in my PhD is to use remote sensing data to monitor issue of oil spillages or general environmental change in Niger Delta. When you look at the rate of oil spillages in Niger Delta, you can even see that almost every part of the delta has been affected with the oil exploration. But the question is, who is going to take responsibility? And when you are talking about the issue of climate change being denied by some people, is the actually function of who is going to take responsibility. Now, part of what I'm looking at currently, which I'm yet to know, is how to link oil production with the gender inequality in sub-Saharan Africa, especially among the petro-states in sub-Saharan Africa. And I want to thank Hales for, in fact, introduce the book of Rose to me, and I'm also using that in my study. How oil production actually informed the performance of women in workforce. And I focus more on chapter 4 of the book of Michael Rose, which is actually good for me. Issue of gender has been what I've also been working on for the past few years. I focus more on the extreme events, and I mean climate change and extreme events in Nigeria and many parts of the world. What do we mean by extreme events? Extreme event to the left and the extreme event to the right. Extreme event to the left, I usually put it that when you have too much of rainfall coming up and causing disaster, causing loss and damage as a result of flood. And extreme to the right, when you have too much temperature, everywhere is dry to the extent that it leads to drought. In Africa, both of these sometimes happen consequent at the same time. Let's see what is going on currently in East Africa. We see drought to the extent that animals, livestock being died. You can see the picture there. People who are struggling to get water. You see, I like the presentation when we were also talking about the fact that water will become a big issue, not only in global south, even in the, not only in global north, even in the global south, as a result of extreme event that is coming up from climate change. This has been my studies that I've been doing for the past. The figure you have, picture you have down there, where you have flood, that was what happened in Lagos, in Nigeria. So in some part of Africa, you are having too much rainfall, leading to flood. And in some other part, you are having too much dryness. And all these are interplay. Why am I bringing this in? Because there I look at the issue of who is actually vulnerable to this change in climate change. And late I discover, which is part of what I also put in the table as part of the author for IPCC, that women are much more vulnerable in Africa to climate change. And this informed me also that children, likewise people with disability, men, of course, and old people. But I will go back to the fact that the issue of women is that experience I've had in many of the researches comparing how women perform in terms of their adaptation to climate change, is what is also leading me to ask this question in terms when you look at issue of decarbonization and Anthropocene, who are actually more vulnerable to the implication of oil exploration in Africa. How is oil production actually affect women, especially how women are advanced in different petro states in Africa, in order to, especially in the labor force, and also to gain seat in parliament in each of these petro states. And like I said, chapter 4 of Rose's book on the oil costs and how petroleum wealth shape the development of nations actually is guiding me, and I'm basing my arguments and my research on that. But we don't know how it will go. This is a very big question in my mind, which is focus of the research I'm doing currently as a postdoc in our hub. So thank you very much. That's all from me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tina. And floor is open for the questions and comments. Anybody? Okay, while people are thinking, I just wonder, Tina, well, you're talking about women, that they are vulnerable to the consequences of the climate change. But you also mentioned Udi massacre, right? So this is obviously, concerns the ethnic minorities inside the. So kind of this is quite trivial to say that vulnerable or marginalized minorities, whoever they are, women, ethnic minorities, I don't know, sexual minorities, whoever, would be more influenced by the current changes, negative changes in the environment than those who live, kind of great life and enjoy the fruits of this life. So the question is, why women? Why not other minorities? Why you chose for your research, for your future research, this particular group?
Thank you so much. This is a very good question. To be honest with you, based on the previous research I've done, I discovered that, in Africa, we have so many ethnic groups, we have so many cultural values, but we'll see that the majority of these cultural values actually do not support women as it should be, especially when you face a kind of disaster or even in economy performance. The question you will ask yourself, which I also try to look at in recent week, is that in all these states we have in Africa, how many women are in the parliament? Nearly all the countries, you don't have 50-50. In fact, sometimes maybe just 10. And why in Africa? Maybe because of the cultural belief. In some community in rural area, they are still men-dominated community or value. Let me put it that way. For example, what I know from the little research I did on climate change, how it affects women generally, is that when there's extreme event, many of these women, the source of income from agriculture usually be with the man, they call them the head of the family. So anytime you have flood, for example, or extreme drought, so the woman will be at the mercy of man in order to be able to cope. And don't forget, sometimes in this culture too, in some of this culture, it is allowed for them to marry more than one wife. So, and no way you will do it, one will be suffered. So actually, generally, it's not only women that are affected. Yes, children are there. But in extreme events, especially in climate change, women tend to be much more closer, even to the children. So the burden of the children will also be on women much more, especially in that kind of community. So that's the way I can just answer that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Johanna?
Thank you, Stina. Thank you, Maxime. My question is actually kind of a follow-up of yours. Just for the sake of brainstorming around new topics, I think the concept of minority, sorry, Maxime, if I'm provoking a little bit, but I think the concept of minority is maybe clouding a little bit our vision of who suffers from climate change or who benefits from it. Because obviously 50% of global population plus any other kind of minorities ends up as a majority, and maybe so to reverse the question, I want to ask you, Sina, who benefits from the disasters caused by climate change? Because obviously we always think of negative impacts. And obviously with oil, you will think of people benefiting from the wealth of export. But is there some kinds of benefits also to, I don't know, ask for specific aids because of the type of destruction of the environment that the country is suffering, or is there any kind of new technologies that actually make money out of trying to fixing the problem in Nigeria or in Central Africa in general? I hope you follow my question.
Yeah, I got it. I got the question. Actually, that's a very good question. The issue of climate change, I think I will also say that not that everything is bad. Sometimes it also makes some countries or some community to look inward into how they are going to solve their problem themselves. So that's the benefit I can say. Take for example, in the flood that happened in 2020, there's another one also in 2022 that was also serious along Niger State in Nigeria. And later on, I discovered that there's the development of new hub on the phone that people can get quick alert when the rainfall is getting too much and when it is about for the river Niger, to overflow and affect the nearby community. So, yeah, it has benefits. People are harnessing new technology to be able to help people, local people to adapt. But still, I will also say that much are still needed to be done in order to be able to achieve this. So much more technological, what I can call technological transfer is needed. Transfer maybe from permitting to still use it global south to global, from global north to the global south, or from urban area even to the rural area. Currently in Nigeria, for example, part of the benefit I will also say is that the NIMET, what is NIMET? Nigeria Meteorological Agency are really working very hard to improve the early warning system in the country, which is quite good. So that's the way I can answer that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sina. Very interesting presentation. I came a little bit late, but not too much. I think I heard most of it. I want to ask you a question which may be a bit outside of your research, but it links in some way to Johanna's question. I don't know very much about Nigeria, but I've looked a bit at the African debates at the moment of decolonization and independence, and clearly energy was a big topic for the orientation of societies. And would you know whether there were or what were the projects of development and the role of energy, and which kind of energy for Nigeria, in a sense, before the oil extraction and and what you showed? Because Nigeria is very populous, and clearly overall the population benefits very little from the oil extraction and the oil export to the larger population. But were there other projects, and what energy and what role did energy play in them? I don't know, maybe it goes outside of your research, but I had a curiosity.
Yeah. To be honest, it's a little bit outside my research area, but still, I can say a little into that. In terms of energy, for a long time ago, Nigeria has been using hydropower energy to generate energy for the whole country, and which we are also doing and expanding that. But you see, there are so many debates currently that we need to do more. How can we even make use of many of the gas being produced in the Niger Delta to generate energy, which is quite good. It will interest you that majority of the gas being produced from the exploration in Niger Delta are just being fired to the atmosphere. So, but in recent time, now we have in Nigeria, we've developed new refineries, actually being anchored by, it's a private one by one man called Dangote. It's one of the largest, the way people put it, refineries in the whole Africa. And it has very high capacity, even to compare to all other refineries in global world. And the benefit of that is that it's going to help in terms of the crude oil will be processed in the country and will refine in the country, and it will also help the economy one way or the other. And last time when I presented something like this, somebody has similar question like your question, Peter. And what I said is that, in fact, part of what there was a follow-up question from Alex too. Part of what I will also think about is how many number of the women that are also engaged in all these new refinery companies compared to men, because I just pick interest in that, so that so it's a good thing for energy in Nigeria. Hydrocarbon has been used, but also recently people are also engaging, but this is not actually federal government project, but government is actually supporting families and communities that want to harness solar panel, solar energy in order to meet the need. And people are doing that currently, putting solar panel everywhere also to get energy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alexander, I had you as my next question, but your hand mysteriously disappeared. So
no, I'm eager to. Yeah, I have a question, but Gustavo was first, and then I will.
Yeah, okay. Let's go to Gustavo then.
Well, mine is not that much of a question, more of a comment, because first, Sina, thank you for your presentation. It was really good, and I would like some comments regarding the fact that Nigeria, it is expected for Nigeria to grow in terms of population and actually to become one of the top, one of the most populous countries in the world in the next 50 or 100 years. So I would like some comments on how increasing the population will be affected and affect all those problems that you touched on.
Thank you very much. Yeah, to be honest, population of Nigeria has been increasing, and then the focus, when you also look at the focus in terms of prediction of how the population will go, there is no possibility that the population will reduce. We'll continue to have high population. But let me say this, that if the government is actually willing, and which the current government is actually doing, to make sure that economy is stabilized, I think population growth should not see as negative only. We can also look at it in terms of the positive aspect of it. For example, that means that we have largest market for people, where people can buy things and people can do businesses. Yes, but one of the things that actually will come to mind is that though we have large population, how many of this population have access to decent job? How many of this population in the future will be able to benefit from the oil production? the population is growing, but I'm not talking only about Nigeria. Even when you look at the population of Africa generally, it's growing compared to other parts of the world. But we should get to the stage where we see those populations as opportunity, not as negative aspect. But the opportunity will come when there's political will in order to use oil revenue to meet the need of the increasing population. I think that's the way I would just answer that. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about refineries and mercantilism. I hope that Henry is still with us and could also contribute. Because this, like while Sina was talking, I Googled refineries in the world, and immediately I found a nice map, all refineries in the world. And they are clearly concentrated in the advanced countries of Europe and North America, and very few in Africa, and very few in Siberia, and very few in Latin America. So there are, but it's like those places that extract oil and export this oil, they don't have refineries. So this is classical imperialism / mercantilism. It's like cotton was produced in the Americas, and then it would be exported to England for processing, and then much more expensive clothing would be exported back to the colonies, and the added value would stay in England. This is just how imperialism works, and the same is with refineries. Like they produce added value. This added value stays in the advanced countries of the West. They need much capital, but they need also highly qualified labor. And I think we see it in the current war in Ukraine, they are also a huge security threat because they are very, very vulnerable. So it's better to have them in a stable country, rather than in a threatened country. And this it's entirely different world in comparison to whatever 18th century cotton production and cotton and British Empire. But the world is different. But in new forms and new technologies, they reproduce the same imperial colonial divide dynamics. So I would really be happy if you guys, Sina and Henry, if you establish some kind of interesting dialogue on refineries and comparing Africa to Siberia and Gustavo maybe also to Venezuela. This refineries and oil derricks and how they sort of gravitate out of each other.
Okay.
Gustavo.
Gustavo, just very short. Yeah.
Just to keep it short, one commentary on refineries from the point of view of Latin America, and I think that it may also apply to Nigeria. I don't know the type of oil that Nigeria produces, but Venezuela and Brazil, they produce, especially Venezuela, it produces a very heavy oil, and refineries, they are fine-tuned for different types of oil. So it's not only how many or where the refineries are, but for which kind of oil it is tuned for. So, for example, Brazilian refineries, they are fine-tuned for lighter oils, which is not the type of oil that Brazil produces. So Brazil produces lots of oil, but also imports lots of oil because of the types of refineries that we have. So for Nigeria, that may also be a problem. And so that would be a brief comment on refineries and that. So we not only have to look at how many refineries there are, we have to look at the types of oil that the country and the oil fields produce, and also if the country is able to refine its own oil.
Yeah,
because clearly
okay.
these technologies are available. They exist in some other countries. So why not it's not the issue of money, because these oil exporting countries have lots of money. So it's not about money, it's not about technology, but it's about something else, like largely about politics, I think, political economy.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. Let me just bring this quick comment that's a very good point. Yeah. For example, you mentioned of Brazil, that they have the type of oil they produce is unique, and also in Nigeria. But the question you will ask yourself further, I will go in line with Alex, is that why not make that type of equipment which Brazil can use to refine their oil available in Brazil? Why must Brazil export the crude to somewhere else and they will now buy it? You know, the thing is, I'm so sorry to bring this capitalism idea into it, and which is, we cannot run away from that. Somebody, somewhere, group of people or certain state want to have control over some other state. And the best way is that you don't have access to that technology, you don't have access to capital to be able to establish yourself, and then we'll be able to get it all from you, and then from there, we sell it back in order to help our economy. That is what interplay in terms of the global market. And we know the implication that when they get this crude oil, especially from Brazil, for example, I can talk more on Nigeria. Compare Brazil currency or Nigerian naira to dollar. You see? And the implication is that when you want to buy this back from them, at times you may even pay like ×2 of the amount they got the thing from you as crude. And one way or the other is going to kill the currency. So global political will around it is complex. And to be honest, I usually tell people that at times it's even beyond the university wall to be able to understand what is going on in global arena. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you very much. It seems that the whole new, kind of research agenda emerged from this discussion. And of course, it would also be quite important probably to see not only where refineries are, but where the refined products go to. So not all of them, not maybe even the overwhelming, kind of much of them, are traveled back to those countries where oil is produced, but probably they are consumed where those refineries are, and then we go to this distinction which I think Peter was talking about between oil producing countries and oil or fuel consuming countries. So that's might be a bit different from older economics of mercantilism, but that's fascinating, obviously, topic to discuss further, and that brings me to our next presenter, Gustavo, who will talk about Venezuela. Please, Gustavo, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, I hope that everyone can see my screen.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Is it in the landscape mode, presentation mode?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Hello everyone. My name is Gustavo Andreao, and today I'm going to present to you my ongoing research on petrostate and carbon societies in Venezuela. I'm currently a postdoc or researcher in the Open Society Hub for the Politics of the Anthropocene there in Vienna, Austria, and also a postdoc in the same research for the Center for Critical Imagination at the Brazilian Center for Analysis and Planning, the CCI-CEBRAP, here in São Paulo, Brazil. So in today's presentation, first I'll recap and present some basic concepts that are good for us to have in mind during the presentation. Then I'll briefly talk about Venezuela until Hugo Chavez. Then I'll talk about Venezuela and PDVSA and oil under Hugo Chavez and Nicolás Maduro. And lastly, especially if we have time, I will give some brief comparisons between Venezuela and other Latin American countries. So in terms of basic concepts, one that is very important for us to have in mind is the concept of the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene is an era in which human activity affects significant portions of the Earth, not only in terms of CO2 emissions, but also in terms of methane emissions, as well as the massive land use changes that we have in the world. The Anthropocene era means that we, as a species, significantly affect the world we live in, and thus our actions as a society will affect the world, affecting not only our own lives, but the lives of future generations. Regarding the Anthropocene definition, some authors, they prefer the term Capitalocene, arguing that it's not the time of the people itself, and that it's not people changing the world, but actually capital and capitalism doing so. One other concept that is important for us to have in mind is the difference between paleomodernity and Gaia modernity. So for paleomodernity, progress is seen as the increase in the use of resources with the same amount or more amounts of energy being used for producing more amounts of goods and services. Paleomodernity comprises colonization, global economies, and global economies with centralized hubs. And in paleomodernity, trust is achieved mainly through centralization. Gaia modernity, on the other hand, sees progress as efficiency, using less energy and work for the same amounts of goods. Gaia modernity comprises green progress, sustainability, and also decentralization, which including the energy generation from renewable sources. In Gaia modernity, trust is achieved through collective responsibility. Gaia modernity is not compatible at all with burning fossil fuels, mainly for all countries, and according to some scholars, it's also not compatible with growth, especially when we consider saturated economies. There is a certain debate about this for the global south. Gaia modernity, it depends on strong states and strong supranational rules, and policies and politics, they are essential to keep ambitions in check, the ambitions of countries, states, and also the ambitions of individuals. Paleomodernity, on the other hand, it can survive in small world networks, meaning that most countries can go to Gaia modernity, but paleomodernity may still be able to survive in small pockets of countries. Another concept that is important for us to have in mind is the concept of the petrostate, which is a classification of a country that is a price maker in terms of oil. We can extend that to other hydrocarbons, as we previously discussed, in terms of coal, in terms of gas, but here we focus on oil. And this means that the country has large oil reserves, produces a significant portion of the world's oil production, and most, if not all, of that production is exported. And lastly, in these basic concepts, we also have the concept of a carbon society, which is any society that heavily relies on carbon fuels, to give a very simple definition. Carbon societies, they produce, export, and import high amounts of hydrocarbons, thus emitting also high amounts of CO2. Important aspect here is that the social and productive structures, as well as other areas such as culture, for example, they are highly intertwined with the over-reliance on fossil fuels. And one good example for how culture is intertwined with that is the idea of the internal combustion car being seen as a sign of liberty, and with people seeing public transportation and even electric vehicles as less than alternatives. One other concept that is important for us to have in mind is Elinor Ostrom's institutional analysis and development framework, which is a framework that emphasizes dynamics and feedbacks and also nonlinear relations between different parts of system. So first we have external variables here on the left, for the biophysical conditions, the attributes of the community, and the rules in use. Those variables, they determine the relative positions of agents in the action situation. And from those positions, those agents, they interact, and outcomes arise from those interactions. The outcomes, they affect the variables in the next system, but the important thing here is that the action situation, the relative positions of agents, they are also affected by those outcomes and by the interactions of those agents. All the while, we also have agents analyzing what is going on in terms of the both interactions and outcomes, in terms of their evaluative criteria. So agents, they have certain agency over what is going on in terms of their, in terms of both outcomes and interactions. One other concept that is important here is institutions as rules of the game, which is a definition by Douglas North. We actually use Crawford and Ostrom definition, in which rules are prescription of actions that agents must do, must avoid, or may do alongside with the benefits or sanctions. So policies, politics, supranational rules, they all fit into this. They can all fit into this description. And one other concept that is important is the concept of polycentrism, especially in the post-Cold War world. So this definition by Vincent Ostrom, actually it predates him, so we can go. So Polanyi had a definition before, but we prefer this definition, in which a polycentric system is any system of decision in which we have a web of autonomous decision structures with limited attributions, be it limited in time, space, scope, etc. Those autonomous decision structures, they determine rules, they enforce those rules, and above all, they revise those rules. So they are able to define policies, they are able to define supranational rules, etc. And when we talk about rules in the actual situation, we have basically inside the actual situation, we have actors that are assigned to certain positions. Those positions have certain actions that agents must do, must avoid, or may do. Those positions, they are linked through information and control to potential outcomes, and what determine those potential outcomes are the net costs and benefits. And around all those items in the actions arena, we have rules. So for example, we have payoff rules that determine and affect the net costs and benefits. We have scope rules, which affect the potential outcomes, and we have choice rules, which determine which actions can be done by certain positions, by certain actors. And lastly, this is especially important when we are talking about transition, which essentially transition is change of process, a process of change. And Ostrom has this very simple yet very powerful equation, in which if the benefits of the current set of rules are deemed as lower than the benefits of a new set of rules, even with the cost of change, then agents start to have incentives to go from the current set of rules to a new set of rules. And we can see this from the point of view of going from carbon intensive to low carbon, from producing oil to producing other types of energies, hydrogen, for example, and also from consuming oil to consuming low carbon options. We can put that equation into more dynamic terms by using the risk opportunity analysis framework, in which benefits become opportunities and costs, they become risks. So now going to Venezuela itself, and having finished this brief concept part. In the pre-Columbian period, humans reached South America between 17 and 9,000 years ago. The Venezuelan territory had lots of different tribes, such as Arawaks, Caribs, etc. And oil was already used by that pre-Hispanic population, as it was abundant and even formed some lakes. The different tribes, they, however, used oil in its crude form as pavement and especially to waterproof boats. So they did not use oil as an energy source. During the Spanish rule, in a similar fashion to other places of Spanish and Portuguese colonization, significant number of indigenous people were killed due to diseases, war, and also due to the enslavement of the population. Spanish America, the use of indigenous forced labor was quite common. Nevertheless, was most prevalent in the areas of gold and silver extraction, such as the territories that would become Mexico, Argentina, etc. Venezuela actually had a brief period of German colonization, but it eventually returned to the Spanish hand. The Venezuelan territory was first controlled from afar cities. So, for example, it was part of the New Spain colony, and it was basically controlled from Mexico City, but then it started to be controlled from more and more closer cities. Venezuela at the time focused on livestock and gold mining, but eventually started to produce and export other types of things. It is important to here's important to notice already the focus on exportation of the American colonies of the time, which is something that would endure in terms of other minerals and especially in terms of hydrocarbons. And Venezuela also relied on enslaved African people brought from Spanish African colonies, which is important when we think of the demographics of Venezuela. So in terms of the independence process of Bolivia, to be brief, it was one of the first regions to declare independence in the Americas in 1811. Its independence process was led by Simón Bolívar, one of the liberators of the Americas, or in Spanish, Libertadores de Américas, together with San Martín, who led the independence process of the South colonies. They had liberal views on both economics and politics. Just a quick question. It's raining a lot here. Can you guys still hear me? Yeah? Okay. If anything...
Yes, perfect.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, if anything, please tell me that so that I can close the window. So, together with San Martín, they led the independence process of those colonies, but they had different views on what would happen to the ex-Spanish colonies after the independence process. Bolívar believed that the ex-colonies should remain together and be ruled as one large republic, whereas San Martín believed that the ex-colonies would remain separate, but they will be ruled by monarchies established around local authority figures. In the end, we ended up with a mix of those two visions, multiple smaller republics, with the exception of Mexico, that remained as a large territory under a newly funded monarchy. We also had the caudillismo process, in which local forces took control of different parts of territory, the caudillos, something common all throughout the ex-Spanish colonies, and we can also discuss that there was a similar process in the former Portuguese colonies in America. In terms of the 20th century Venezuela, Juan Vicente Gómez took office in 1908, and he stayed president until 1935. When oil companies learned of the potential of Venezuelan oil, they rushed to the country, and they were met with a government that would present them with concessionary system. The first industrial extractions of oil occurred in Táchira, and later a refinery opened in the region, focusing on kerosene, which was the main product at the time. Venezuela actually had, and still has, a law that meant that individuals, including companies, could own soil, but that everything below ground belonged to the state. This is a very common law all throughout Spanish America, and is also a law in Brazil, which also comes from the Portuguese colonization process. In 1927, oil was already the most valuable export product of Venezuela, and the country became one of the top exporters of oil in the world and the second largest producer, only behind the USA. Oil rents, they were not seized by most of the population, with Gómez preferring to boost the wealth of friends, family, and some political allies. In terms of the broad population, there started to be a clear disparity between those working for oil-related companies and those that did not. To some scholars, this was the start of a clear Dutch disease in the country, in which Venezuela started to focus more and more on oil. We had some relatively democratic elections at the time, and we had the surge of the Democratic Party, Partido Democrático Venezolano, Venezuelan Democratic Party. argues some strong reformist agendas. Between 1945 and 1948, the Acción Democrática, or Democratic Action, gained control of government through a coup d'etat, and once again was taken out of power through another coup d'etat. In 1948, a new concession model was developed in which rent would be divided 50-50 between companies and the state. A triumvirate of military personnel then held office until elections in 1952, in which another general was elected. His rule ended in 1958 with, once again, another coup d'etat. In the 1960s, some of the grants to multinationals were halted, and Venezuela actively contributed to the creation of OPEC. The Corporación Venezolana del Petróleo, the Venezuelan Oil Corporation, was created in the 1960s and remained responsible for the extraction, refining, and exportation of oil until the creation of Petróleo de Venezuela, or PDVSA, in 1975. The 60s also saw a rise of the Orinoco region as a producing region, with its huge oil reserves being found in 1967 by geologists. The decade also saw a rise in guerrilla warfare despite political and economic stability. In 1967, Venezuela nationalized its iron and especially its oil industry. Nevertheless, a 1971 law would already promote such nationalization with the end of concession contracts. During those 2 decades, oil prices surged, and those able to reach the oil rents in Venezuela, they increased their wealth significantly. In the 1980s, similarly to most of Latin America, Venezuela underwent economic stability and crisis, which increased corruption and almost led to conflicts between Venezuela and Colombia in 1987 due to a dispute of sovereignty regarding the Gulf of Venezuela near the oil-rich city of Maracaibo. In 1986, oil prices plummeted, which led to fiscal problems, ultimately resulting in Venezuela reaching out to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, in order to rebalance its deficit. And this is where Hugo Chavez comes into picture, as Chavez led 2 coup d'etat attempts in 1992, leading him to be ousted by the Congress. And this happened mainly because in the 1990s, Venezuela followed the Washington Consensus due to the IMF loan clauses, reducing subsidies, privatizing several state-owned companies and services, etc., which actually affected the lives of the population. The president at the time was impeached, and Calderon returned to a second term. The 1993 election saw a record high abstention level of 40%. Calderon released Chavez from jail, which was promised when he was running for president, and Chavez eventually ran for presidency and won in 1998. Chavez promoted a new constitution approved by referendum. 2002, we had a coup d'etat attempt, which led to a recall referendum, which Chavez won, but there was also a constitutional referendum in 2007, which he lost. This proposed referendum would increase the powers of the president, so it was a clear indication that the population did not want a very centralized type of government here. The end of the term limits was approved in a referendum in 2009, meaning that Chavez could rule for as much as he would be elected. In terms of oil and PDVSA, Chavez ruled during a period of commodity boom, which led to his increase in popularity and also to increase in terms of the economic activity of the country. This commodity boom also affected other Latin American regions such as Brazil and Chile. Chavez won again in 2012, but he died in 2013. Following his death, Maduro became an interim president before narrowly winning the 2013 election. There has been significant increases under Maduro. There have been significant increases in despotism, and Maduro has endured some coup d'etat attempts, one alternative government by Juan Guaidó, and several internal and foreign protests. In last election, which Maduro claims to have won, this last election is largely up to debate. So the results are being kept a secret, and most international spectators have not agreed on how the results were announced. To some, Maduro has perverted the original ideals and intentions of the Bolivarian revolution, whereas to some, he is a true heir of such ideals. And in terms of oil and PDVSA, in 2017, the USA government started imposing sanctions due to allegations of corruption, embezzlement, and money laundering. This followed a steep decline in Venezuela's international rating. Following those events, the production and exportation of oil fell sharply. This led to a sharp decline in international reserves, as well as a worsening of the balance of payments of Venezuela, which also happened because of the reduction in oil price since mid-2010s. And actually, those sanctions, they brought Maduro's Venezuela closer to Putin's Russia and also closer to China. So we can characterize Venezuela as the Latin American petrostate of the 21st century. We can check some boxes in terms of Venezuela being a petrostate. The first box is Venezuela being a large producer and having large reserves of oil. It actually is one of the, if not the largest owner of oil reserves in the world. And in terms of denial, deception, and normalization, Venezuela also checks those boxes. So denial is a part of Chavez Venezuela. The government denies any problems with elections, as well as denying any wrongdoings of the state regarding the mismanagement of PDVSA, mismanagement of fiscal rule, mismanagement of development in other areas other than oil-related areas, and also denies corruption. And normally it puts all blame on American sanctions or on other types of protests and opposition. In terms of deception, Venezuela has a similar aspect as Russia, because due to deindustrialization, CO2 levels have actually plummeted, and deception is also quite common during elections. In terms of normalization, Venezuela this week attempted to enter the BRICS Plus, and normally, and the government always says that business as usual is common in Venezuela. So for the central government, Venezuela has business as usual for regarding the 2024 elections. It has business as usual regarding the 2017 protests. It has business as usual regarding other types of other situations. And in terms of military actions, not only we have militarization of PDVSA and other areas of the country, but we also have military being used against the population in terms of protests, and we also have increase in the use of military actions regarding the Guiana-Essequibo region. The region itself is part of Guyana, which is a former British colony, and how the region got into British hands is a little bit of a shady history, but however, we have militarism growing regarding reconquering the Guiana-Essequibo region for Venezuela. And with the time that we have, I would just like to give some brief comparisons between Venezuela and other Latin American countries. So regarding Mexico, Mexico was also colonized by the Spanish. However, it had a brief monarchist experiment after independence. Mexico has the Petróleo de México, Pemex, which is a state-owned company, although there are several other companies producing, extracting, and exporting oil in the country. It's important to notice that Mexico's biggest partner in terms of importing oil is the USA, which is also a very large economic partner of the country. Regarding Trinidad and Tobago, which are two islands just off the coast of Venezuela, they were first colonized by the Spanish, but then later they went into British hands. They had a very late independence process in 1962, and they also have a state-owned oil and gas company, which is Petrotrim. However, the country has a large number of companies operating there. The country, however, Trinidad and Tobago, however, focuses on natural gas, especially on liquefied natural gas for exportation. And lastly, comparing Venezuela to Brazil, Brazil was not colonized by the Spanish. Brazil was colonized by the Portuguese, which means that the colonization process had several differences as well as some similitudes. Brazil also has a state-owned oil company, which is Petrobras. However, similarly to PDVSA, it suffered with recent corruption scandals and had some of its operations diminished, especially the operations regarding expansion of investments and regarding pre-salt. Brazil, one important difference here is that the most of the Brazilian oil comes from the ocean, which means that Petrobras is one of the few oil companies with large offshore experience. And Brazil discovered pre-salt in the late 2000s, which are large oil reserves more than 7 kilometers below ocean level, which now represents most of the Brazilian recent oil production and exportation. And one important aspect here is that the Brazilian refineries, they were not made for Brazilian oil, meaning that Brazil exports lots of oil, but also imports lots of oil, especially because Brazil has a very strong dependence of oil because most of the transportation of goods is done by highways and done by trucks. And just one important last aspect here that I would like to stress is that dictatorships and coup d'etats, they were very common in Venezuela. They were very common in the Latin American history. So there is a common history for Latin America in terms of having despotism, having authoritarian governments, and also in having oil producing companies. So that is a sort of common history between us all. So with that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm open to questions and commentaries.
Thank you very much. We have around 10 minutes for questions and answers. So Peter is the first.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gustavo. I actually have 3 questions, but I think they are short and maybe one is out of your remit. The first is, I was struck in Giuliano's presentation this morning. He gave quite some importance from the title onwards to Perez Alfonso, and he didn't appear in your presentation. I mean, I see him a bit from Giuliano's account, also from Giuliano's book, as someone who tried to develop a country using oil resources but not becoming a petrostate, putting conservation and also social political democracy in the center. But he doesn't appear in your account. Maybe you didn't look at that earlier period, so skip the question in that case. Second, a very short question. Given the sanctions regime, and that's my ignorance, where does Venezuela export to nowadays? And thirdly, and that relates, it's maybe a question for the whole group and to Alexander, and also to Sina. Alexander puts the emphasis in terms of aggression on external aggression and on transit states. Now, I assume Venezuela and also Nigeria export mostly by sea. And there is a difference because Venezuela potentially is aggressive towards Guyana. But otherwise, with your emphasis on dictatorships and coup d'etat, maybe one should systematically introduce domestic aggression, sort of authoritarianism, as a characteristic of petrostates structurally, because it is an economic regime which benefits only a minority and thus has some inclination towards oppressing the majority. Thanks for your attention. Respond to what you want and can. I mean, there were just things that came to mind with your very interesting presentation.
Okay. Do I answer or do I
Yes,
collect more
Gustavo,
questions?
go ahead for the moment.
Go.
Yes.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for the questions. This attempt to create a non-oil dependent Venezuela was an attempt, but to most scholars, it did not go into fruition. So I did not delve that much into it, but I do intend to look more into that. In terms of where does Venezuela export, one important aspect here is that, and this is common for authoritarian regimes all throughout the world, official records, they must be taken with certain regard. So we can, for example, in terms of Venezuela's inflation rates, we have to look at those records with certain regard. And so in terms of to where Venezuela is exporting oil, we have certain there is a type of regime in which it exports one country and that country exports to another. So I haven't delved that much into recent post-sanction Venezuela exports, but I've already checked that this is, I have to take official records into consideration, but I have to also look beyond those official records. And in terms of domestic use of military personnel, that is more of my focus here, because we do not have an all-out war between Venezuela and Guyana, which would also involve Brazil, because that region, if you look into a map, that region makes almost like a C on top of Brazil. It's almost like a hat on top of Brazil. So it would directly affect Brazil, especially because it is in the Amazon region. So, but when we look at the use of military personnel and the rise of military personnel on public areas and on public companies, it's clear as day that there is a clear increasing military action and military importance. And actually, to some, that is what kept the Chavez and the Maduro regimes working. So being closer and closer to the military is, to some scholars, is what is keeping the regime intact.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Henry?
Thank you so much for your fascinating presentation. You actually answered my question, or at least part of it, with your answer there. But when I look at the available data, especially the data which isn't from the Venezuelan government, but people who present themselves as independent researchers, Venezuela strikes me as very similar to Venezuela under Maduro. Strikes me as very similar to the late Soviet Union. It imports a lot of food. It has rationing. There's a definite people, for all intents and purposes, aren't getting enough of what they need. But yet, election, some might say stolen election after election, and despite all of the protests, the regime is, what could be considered to be amazingly resilient, especially as, I don't think that you can compare the Venezuelan Secret Service with the Soviet KGB. So effectively, it stays alive, although it has much less in terms of internal security and even military than what the Soviet Union had. So maybe you could delve a bit more into the reasons why scholars think, or why you personally think, that Venezuela seems so resilient, although it resembles the late Soviet Union, which collapsed.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your questions. The importance of imports in Venezuela is huge and has been increasing since the 1990s. Some would say that includes the options for privatizing and the neoliberal actions that Venezuela took until the rise of Chavez as president. And that's basically what goes on in the country. So the country exports oil, gets reserves, and uses those reserves to buy almost everything that they need. And that is why now, with the reduction in exports and the reduction of the reserves, the Venezuelan people have been suffering with hunger. They have been suffering with reduced amounts of goods, services, medicine, for example, such as medicine for diabetes, for example. And that is also related to the oil curse, the Dutch disease, in which Venezuela clearly opted for going more towards an oil industry. And regarding the last question, why the Venezuelan regime seems so resilient, seems to, despite everything that has happened in recent years and recent decades, why it's still going on? One difference that I find between Venezuela and Russia and Soviet Union is the very reduced territory. So not only is there less in terms of population, but especially in terms of the territory. So when you have a smaller territory, it is easier for you to control the territory in a centralized way. And one important aspect for me and for lots of scholars is that Chavez, and especially Maduro, has been putting more and more military personnel into higher ranking positions regarding companies, regarding the state, and that. And we also have, we have to remember here that even though the elections, the last elections and the elections before, even though they appear to be rigged and to have, to not be clean elections at all, we have to remember that Maduro has supporters, and Maduro still has lots of supporters. The Venezuelan regime has lots of supporters, and it is part of it relates to how Maduro and the government provides for those people in terms of medicine, in terms of food, and etc. So it's not only because of the military personnel in higher ranking positions, in which they have not tried any coup d'etats in more than 20 years, which, if you look into Venezuelan history, it's kind of outstanding. And it's not only because of that, but also because in terms of the certain parts of the population, there is still some populist actions that Maduro has undertaken.
Okay, thank you. Alexander?
Yeah, thanks, Gustavo. That's, of course, like a dream that we have an expert on Venezuela in our team. Very welcome. I have a question actually a suggestion, a kind of collective suggestion to look at gender issues in connection to oil. I call it the gender carbon nexus. And as Sina introduced us to this emerging field of studies, and it was initiated by Michael Ross in his seminal book, Oil Course, one particular chapter on gender in the Arab countries. So the methodology there is very, very simple. So Ross identified those Arab countries that have oil and those that don't have oil, and compare these groups of countries in terms of women participation in labor, in education, in elections, in the parliament, also divorce rate, number of children per family. So various indicators, very simple, basically, kind of comparing of averages. One could, of course, create something more sophisticated like regressions, but the result is always the same, that the more oil is in the country, the lower, the more is gender inequality. The lower are various rights of women. The more oil, the worse is the situation of women in the country. Even though most of these countries are Muslim countries, and more or less the same climate, more or less the same religion, there are differences, of course, but more or less the same culture. So explanation is also pretty simple, actually, that if there is oil, so men own it and the men distribute these profits how they want. But if there is no oil, something else should be developing, say textile industry. And textile industry is, jobs to women. Or nowadays it could be IT industry also, much more equal. So I think this could be reproduced. This method could be pretty easily reproduced in other parts of the world, such as Central Asia, say comparing Kazakhstan with some other, or Tajikistan with non-oil or non-gas bearing countries, or Eastern Europe, comparing Russia to say to Ukraine and Poland and things like that, or Latin America. And then, like, if we could do that, also we could somehow try to invite Michael Ross himself or engage him possibly. But that would actually create a pretty doable global research, in which a kind of unified methodology would be applied to different parts of the world with, I guess, with predictable results. Predictable, but still kind of very interesting, theoretically, whatever, politically quite exciting. So let's think about that. Sina and I were talking about it already. So there is Africa, could be Latin America is available, I guess, also Eastern Europe. Hopefully we could invite our colleagues from Central Asia. So we could run a workshop in Vienna on this kind of gender carbon nexus. So let's think about it in the most practical terms.
Okay. Well,
Thank you.
Can I comment?
Yeah,
okay. Yeah, no, I do think that it's really possible for us to look at those gender issues related to oil. We would only have to be careful with current indicators because of problems with transparency and etc. But if there are numbers and if there are indicators, it's something that we really can do. And it's important to notice that in terms of Venezuela, it's not only more oil and more gender inequality, but it's more inequality in general. But probably if you look into Venezuela, I do not have the numbers with me, but if you look into Venezuela, the inequality is a problem, but the gender inequality would be a worse problem. But in Venezuela, you also have to look at inequality from the point of view of gender and from the point of view of demographics of the different ethnicities that are in the country. So we also have to have this in mind, which is maybe a problem that is not that much prevalent in other petrostates. And in that regard, it would be good to compare Venezuela with other oil-producing countries, especially with Brazil, which has high inequality, but has been dealing with that inequality in the later years. And to some extent, it has been dealing with that inequality, especially because it has been increasing its oil production. And that could be an option. So I do think that for looking into Venezuela, it's always good to compare Venezuela with other oil producing companies, especially Brazil and to a certain extent Trinidad and Tobago, because it's a really small country and it's on the coast of Venezuela. So it's really close.
Excellent.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we have one question in the meeting chat from Matteo, who apparently cannot speak in the environment he's situated now. So he asking, well, he first of all thanks Gustavo for really interesting presentation and asked the question. Could you perhaps elaborate a little bit more on your theoretical conclusions? What can we learn from the Venezuelan case with respect to the role of institutions, which you were describing at the beginning.
Okay. So yeah, I didn't put a conclusion, a concluding remarks at the end. But so in terms of what we can learn from the Venezuelan case, it is important to have in mind that the actors, Venezuela has produced oil since the beginning of the century. And the actors, they have changed all throughout the time. But not only the actors, but also the political and the international environment has changed a lot. And so it's important for us to notice the changes, what changes, what remains, and also how Venezuela deals with the rest of the world and how the rest of the world deals with Venezuela. So, for example, Venezuela was one of the OPEC founders. So Venezuela has had an active role in creating OPEC. So we have to look from the point of view of which actors are active in terms of Venezuelan oil. In terms of institutions, especially right now, it's important for us to look at the rise of military personnel and the rise of military personnel in the regime, and also to look into how those institutions are responding to sanctions. So, for example, we have the problem of exporting oil to a certain country, and that country exporting oil to another country, bypassing the sanctions. So that is important for us to look and to analyze. And there is also a question about other resources such as coal, shale gas, and rare earth. So most of Venezuelan oil is a very, very, very heavy oil. Most, if not all. Not sure if there is any type of oil in Venezuela that is not that much heavy. So that type of oil is extracted in a sort of different way from the Arab oil, and also different from the oil that is extracted in Brazil. So that we have that. In terms of coal and rare earths, I have not studied that yet, but I do believe that there is some rare earths there, but not that much when you compare, especially to regions like China or Africa, for example. At least in terms of the amounts that is exported. In terms of the production of electricity, it's mostly oil and I believe gas. And I don't think that coal is that much important in terms of the production of electricity in Venezuela, which is also the case for Brazil. Brazil does not use coal that much.
Okay, thank you very much, Gustavo. And now we are a bit behind schedule, and from Africa and Latin America, we're going back to Eurasian continent, and Johanna will talk about European markets. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. I am indeed going to drive you back to the European continent, but I'm going to present to you very new research. So I'm going to present to you things I already know and big questions. And the point here is to pick your brain so that you can think with me about the directions I should follow. And I'm going to share all my insights with you. And at a fresh breath to start this presentation, I wanted to share with you this super sale, because maybe you want to do shopping. You can currently buy for quite cheap amount of money oxygen can. And if you don't like just regular fresh air, you can also buy peppermint oxygen or strawberry oxygen. That's a thing now. And don't think you're super trendy doing this, because apparently Japanese people have been doing it since the late 80s. And obviously, we all want to breathe fresh air because we're suffocating out there, and that's a chart to show you the amount of unbreathable carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And you see that there have been projections for the decade we're living in to see if the carbon dioxide emissions are exceeding a certain amount, then we are pretty sure the temperature is going to increase by 1.5 degrees. So we are already past that, and now we are just riding face towards the 2 Celsius degrees that everybody's fearing, and here we are. So in the face of this crazy crisis we're living in, the European Commission has come up with the creation of the emission trading schemes. The origin of this story starts in the 90s with the Kyoto Protocol, actually, because for those who remember and for those who were not born yet, the Kyoto Protocol imposed or start to create some incentives to all the countries that were attending the conference to imagine schemes to curb the carbon emissions in their countries. So obviously, maybe you remember that the US was there, but they did not ratify the protocol, China either, but the European Union did. And what came out of the brainstorming that followed up the Kyoto Protocol in Europe was the creation of a market, a carbon market, an artificial market created by the Commission to fix regular market failures that would be too many emissions. Just going to explain to you very briefly how this market works. So the European Commission sets a cap on the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are allowed for covered sectors. And based on this cap, you can see on the graph, I hope it's readable for you, that the European Union sets the number of allowances that will be issued during the year. Okay. Then in September of each year, industries must surrender to the European Commission as many allowances as CO2 emitted during the year. Otherwise, they have heavy fines. And so far, we can say right now that the compliance rate is over 97%. So the whole scheme is actually working on European industries. Now, these allowances can be bought, sold, or traded among participants. That's why it's a market-based approach to emission reductions. And industries can purchase allowances from the European Commission at daily auctions. So that's the primary market. Or they can trade them with other participants, and that's the secondary market. So the price of allowances evolve constantly based on supply and demand as a regular market. As the supply reduces over time, the price of allowances increases. That's the whole point of this system. So the carbon price is the trade-off value for decarbonization investments. That's the main objective of the ecological objective of the creation of this market. When the value of allowances increases, industries have a stronger incentive to invest in decarbonization to avoid the cost of emissions. And it is estimated that increasing the price of a quota by €1 per ton leads to an average reduction of 0.73% of emissions over time. So by holding permits and reducing the available supply, investors can put pressure on prices. That's the theory, let's say, behind the whole logic of this market mechanism. Obviously, the whole creation of this ETS has not just been organized from the get-go as it is now today. It has been implemented through phases, and we're now in the 4th phase, but it's supposed to help curb all these emissions. If you look at the results of this for the past 10 years, you can be optimistic because the different sectors covered by this market system are actually reducing their carbon emissions. And if we want to have a more grounded approach to this market, we can look at a map of Europe of where are the industries that are actually producing greenhouse gas emissions and that are being part of this system. I'm sorry, I'm maybe going a bit fast, and I'll let you have a look at this map and at the whole coverage of different industries. As you can see, just based on the color of the map, that the combustion is the most important, metallurgy a little bit, and we do have refineries here and there, but like the chemical industry, for example, is not that important, and the cement and lime is not either. I will show you, compared to other regions of the world later, why. Europe is not the only one, obviously, thinking of this kind of systems, and you have different instrument type to try to curb carbon emissions through market incentives or through financial incentives. For example, you can see that in certain regions, in red on this map, you have countries that have imposed a carbon tax. That's another way of trying to change the game. We have ETS in Europe, but not only, because China also has implemented it, even though it's not exactly on the same system, but still. And you can see other countries have tried to implement both. Obviously, the whole discussion is still going on in certain countries. Now, this is a graph I wanted to show you because it has been interestingly produced by New Zealand, the New Zealand Ministry of the Environment, to show that New Zealand is the best at implementing any kind of, so that's funny. But just to show you that Europe is not necessarily the best in terms of sectoral coverage. So here you can see that, as I showed you before, we have industries that are pretty well covered, but others absolutely not. And I just want to point out, for example, that waste is absolutely not covered by this carbon market incentive. Transport is not, the building industry is not either. So there is a very long way to go, I guess, in Europe to try to make this carbon market an actual instrument for the ecological transition. And other countries are not that bad, especially in Asia and the Pacific. Now, based on this very general knowledge, I have a few questions that I've been exploring. First, obviously, I'm a historian, so I studied with the myth of origins, and I followed the efforts by the president of the European Commission of the time, Jacques Delors, his efforts to respond to the problem. And originally, what Jacques Delors did was not to design a European market, but rather to try to impose a carbon tax. And I wrote here as a Trojan horse into European fiscality, because one of the major obstacles to do that in the European Union is the unanimity rule to vote for fiscal reforms. And in Europe, until now, there has never been any unanimity among all European countries to vote for common fiscality. So for Jacques Delors, who was at the time maybe more interested actually in fiscality than in the environment, he thought that proposing or imposing a carbon tax would work as under the environmental chapter of the European Union, would work as a Trojan horse into the fiscal chapter. But anyway, even if it was kinky and provocative in his way of governing the European Union, it did not work. So he tried for a very long time and eventually he failed. But what's interesting is that during the whole decade he tried to implement this carbon tax, he met a lot of people and he tried to, he really created the right conditions so that this discussion about carbon emissions could happen in Europe. And I'm just showing you a few archives I found from the European Union archives in Florence. These are a few documents of one of his trips to the United States, where he discussed these problems, notably with Al Gore, former US Vice President Al Gore. You must know Al Gore as obviously the one who was elected president, but actually was not, against George W. Bush, but also he has been recognized an environmentalist. He has tried for a very long time to lobby for environmental reforms and legislation in the US. And so just to keep in mind maybe the chronology of events during this trip in 1993, we're just a year after the Kyoto Protocol, the summit in Kyoto, where the US in the end did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol. It was the result of a very big failure, obviously, within US domestic politics, of people pushing for this kind of legislation to convince the whole class of US politicians to ratify this treaty. And there is a whole story behind it that I've been digging in about lobbying, internal lobbying, disinformation, and a lot of anti-climate change activities in the US to undermine all these efforts. And it was a success because then they did not ratify the treaty. So that's a bit the context in the US, and Jacques Delors found his own allies within this efforts too. And he was really influenced by Al Gore's proposition to create what has been implemented in California, a sort of what he called a flexible system, and it's actually a bit the same kind of market mechanism I just exposed that the European Union later implemented. So back to the question I'm asking about the origins of the European carbon market, there is a story in the relation between Europeanists and American environmentalists. And I have to explore this. That's the positive nexus, but there is also maybe, I don't know, I still need to explore that, a negative nexus with the opposition to climate reforms. So maybe also between the US and Europe. It's the story about US lobbyists is more known than in the European lobbyists, but this is something I have to dig in. So following this second trend, not just about the origin story, but also about the opposition story of the zero emission targets and any kind of initiatives, including carbon markets or carbon taxes, I am trying to identify different trends. What I have been identifying so far are two trends. One is geopolitical and one is more economical. The geopolitical trend of opposition can be traced to Germany and Poland, that are two countries that massively rely on coal production. The rationale behind this opposition is that, my rationale, my logic to identify this has been that based on the discussions we have since the beginning of this hub with Alexander, what's surprising kind of with the European carbon markets is that, as I showed you in the market mechanism processes, is that it's basically taxing consumers, people who produce emissions by burning fuel. It's not taxing producers it's not taxing entities that extract fossil fuel. So it can be a bit surprising because there is here a disequilibrium between of responsibility in face of carbon emissions. One of the explanation when we look at internal history in Europe is that Poland and Germany have been very officially confronting and opposing these reforms and these incentives because they're coal producers and they did not want to have the burden of paying the taxes on the extraction of coal. The problem was already there in the beginning of the 2000s. It's still here. I'm just giving you a short hint because last year, the climate minister of Poland officially filed a lawsuit against European regulations and their targets for the zero emission neutral car in Europe. Because they're considering that they're paying an unfair price in this in these objectives. So there is this story of coal producers that obviously wait in the history of carbon markets, and that has a final consequence when we ask about how do we understand the relation between Europe and its non-European energy exporters who sell their fuel to Europe, because here indeed there is once again a disequilibrium, but that comes from this internal disequilibrium with Poland and Germany. Long story short, now there is obvious discrepancies between all these countries because all the European countries that are participating in the European carbon market are all participating in the same auction house, and Germany has its own parallel auction house. It's a different system, so I have to try to dig in a little bit that difference to understand how come that Germany managed to have its own action house and did not participate in the same kind of market organization as the rest of European countries. So that's the, let's say, more state level discussion. And then there is also the private discussion with particular industries and particular think tanks and lobbyists. So I'm showing you here a book that has just come out on climate obstruction across Europe. It's each chapter is a case study, a national case study. Sadly for me, it's extremely recent history. It's really about the last few years and the opposition to the Green Deal. So it does not go back to the past 20 or 30 years, but it's already very interesting to see how climate obstruction maps among all these actors, and I've been talking to some of the authors, so I hope that I will find more cool things in these directions. And then the last question, the 1 billion question, I need to ask when I explore this topic is the European carbon markets a greenwashing instrument? And instead of answering by myself, I'm just going to use two different perspectives on this. Some environmentalist organizations do think it's greenwashing, and WWF has been very kindly proposing to the European Commission some sorts of internal reforms to help the European Commission transform the carbon markets into something that would be actually helpful for the environment and not just a marketing greenwashing instrument. And then I just wanted to share with you the 85th point of yesterday's declaration by the BRICS, because the summit is going on in Russia right now, and they have a point dedicated to carbon markets. So I'm just going to read it to you for those who can't really read their screens because it's small. So it's the BRICS speaking. We recognize the important role of carbon markets as one of the drivers of climate action and encourage enhancing cooperation and sharing experiences in this field. We oppose unilateral measures introduced under the pretext of climate and environmental concerns and reiterate our commitment to enhancing coordination on these issues. We welcome the adoption of the MOU on the BRICS Carbon Markets Partnership as a platform dedicated to sharing knowledge, experiences, and case studies of developing carbon markets and discussing the potential intra-BRICS cooperation on carbon markets to exchange views on potential cooperation, etc., of the Paris Agreement among the BRICS countries. So, with a very simple logic of beware of who is happy about your initiatives and how the rhetoric is circulating, and obviously if carbon markets can be a happy solution for petro-aggressive states in this world against the green transition, maybe there is a flawed logic in it. I hope this gives you much food for thoughts and that it can open the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Johanna. Colleagues, questions or answers to Johanna's questions? Peter?
Yes. Thank you, Maxime. Thank you, Johanna. Very interesting. I have two small observations. I mean, this is a very complex matter, as you showed, and just two doubts. But maybe I'm wrong, and you can clarify. The one is about the obstruction examples in Europe, where I'm a bit. But maybe you refer to a slightly earlier period, that you referred to Poland and Germany with regard to the coal mining, because as someone, well, I think Stefan this morning said this is in Germany basically now the phasing out of coal mining and the dealing with the lignite mining. That is also surface extraction that is indeed has been accelerated. So I wouldn't, in Poland it's a different matter, but I wouldn't really expect much obstruction on the German part any longer, whereas the car industry and the combustion engines, that's a big issue in Germany because of the size and the importance of the car industry, much more, I think, than the coal matter, but maybe you have other information there. And the second point was upon this BRICS declaration. I tend to think, but that is maybe against the background of my research for my presentation this morning, is that this probably it takes rather the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which I think Alexander mentioned this morning, because that is indeed a unilateral measure that would have an effect of those who want to export to the European Union. Whereas the carbon pricing is in a sense a more flexible issue and not in the same way interfering with others. These are the two observations. And then on your broad approach, it seems to me that how one evaluates that, and you showed the critical and the more positive views of it. Apart from many other aspects, it depends very much on the price. I mean, I've recently attended a seminar by economists who basically were showing that from the original damage assessment of carbon emissions going back to William Nordhaus, it has gone from 10 euro per ton to 1,000 euro per ton. And that makes a big difference. And I think one is not, if carbon pricing remains at a more or less symbolic level, which will not have much effect, it may well be a success in terms of implementation, but not lead anywhere. Whereas it will probably lead to much more obstruction and resistance if it goes to higher prices. But that's just that's the broader observation.
Thank you. Absolutely. Just to pick in disorder, your remarks on the BRICS and the tax mechanism, absolutely, and that's maybe why I think that if the tax system in Europe is a problem for a country like Russia, and if the carbon market is not, then we can think of geopolitically of one solution in different terms than the other. And also with the whole question we're trying to pursue of are carbon markets provocation or deterrence for petro states, then maybe not really, when maybe a carbon tax would be very much more efficient. I don't know, but at least provocative or so that's absolutely a big question for external geopolitics. Now about the Germany and the coal industry. In the future, you're absolutely right. And then the car industry, not just in Germany, also in France or everywhere that there is a car industry in Europe, is going to become a huge player in lobbying, in opposing regulations, and I guess. But then, indeed, I was interested in the original oppositions. And to understand how the carbon markets have been shaped and created and organized, and why Germany has its own independent auction house when everybody else is trading in the same auction market, and why would the Germans try to actually slow down the process at that time. And I think it came from the coal miners, but you're right, it's not exactly the same history as Poland, and it's very important to flesh out two different kind of oppositions and trajectories, because you're right, Poland is still very much dependent on coal, when Germany not as much. And then absolutely for the broader question, the price, it's completely price dependent, and you're absolutely right to point the difference between the success of implementing a policy and then the actual success of this policy by influencing prices. What's interesting is that when you ask public officials or commissioners who have been involved in the creation of this market, they always tell you a success story because the implementation has been going well. And that's part of, I guess, the technocratic rhetoric of the European Commission to always be very happy with everything that's been done. And I don't know, I keep thinking about this because obviously we are going to discuss the Draghi report that is also mentioning this question of carbon markets, and this there is a big divergence between the actual environmental effect and the bureaucratic success of these initiatives. But then it obviously would have social effects if it was really completely efficient price-wise, because then prices would go up more. And yeah, that's thank you for this. That's part of the the questions I have to keep living with for the coming months.
Thank you. Thank you. Alexander?
Yeah, there is another aspect to all this that we of course discussed with Johanna, but I think it's very striking that these corporations that have their quotas for burning oil and gas and coal, so they pay per their emissions, but those other corporations who supply these burners with fossil fuel, they do not pay. They are not a part of the scheme at all. So it would be either Gazprom or say German coal miners, so or whatever, or Statoil or Norwegian Oil Corporation. So they supply. So their oil or gas, they are part and parcel of every emission, of every ton of emission, but only those who burn, like electric plants, for instance, they pay. But those who supply, they don't pay. They do it together, but one part pays, that part doesn't pay. And that's, of course, is kind of whatever, from whatever perspective, this is entirely unjustifiable and unfair, I think. But strangely enough, this question hasn't been raised, as far as I know.
Well, maybe as a kind of another question in this, well, more or less in this line, but maybe not so much related to Europe, but to Asia. In well, for example, take the capital of Kyrgyzstan, Bishkek. Every winter for several days, this is the most polluted city in the world. However, well, otherwise it's a very livable city. And the problem not in corporations, the problem not in industry, which does not exist basically in Kyrgyzstan. The problem is hitting private houses, who burn very coal of very low quality. And I'm not sure about the contribution to the green gas emission, but greenhouse gas emission, but to unbreathability of the air. Certainly, this is the main kind of polluter in Central Asia, but not only in Central Asia. I mean, take Delhi, take India. I mean, that's kind of smoke, which is very characteristic of those cities, is produced not even so much by the industry, but by the private houses. How to regulate that? This is a question.
Yeah, that's interesting, because you mentioned the fact that it's bad, also technologies, and so it's not just about what you put in your heating system. It's also maybe you have no filters or nothing to, so no technological improvement of.
Of course, it's costly because this is for private houses of very poor people. They just put coal in the burner, and coal of very, very, very low quality, or even not coal, but some trash, and that is the source of pollution.
Well, what you're saying makes me think of the fact that there is a big topic. If I may just reshare for a second my slides, because there was one slide that I found interesting in that aspect. If you can see that, on the different sectors that are covered by the European emission trading system. Sorry, this is not it. Yeah, do you see that? Yes.
Yes.
You can see that waste and buildings are not covered by it, and I think it's absolutely key when we talk about two things. One, it would be poverty an inequality, like ecological inequality among populations, because that has been a topic for the past few winters in Europe, that poor people can't afford quality heating. And it's not just about having houses that can't keep the heat inside, but also because you have really bad quality systems too. And so the poorer you are, the more emissions you're producing. But just because you don't have, it's just the same with cars, right? If you don't have a Tesla, then you're obviously polluting more. So somehow, if you're trying to weight the responsibility of individuals, then poorer people are paying the most, because they are producing the most emissions. And at the same time, the waste problem is very interesting, because the European Union is externalizing its waste treatment a lot. It's sending waste in a lot of countries. Depending on the sector, you have a whole new global economy and international division of labor related to waste. Just from the top of my mind, I know that from the textile industry, that is one of the most polluting industry in the world, the European Union that does not produce textile but consumes textile so much and throw textiles away every year, is sending it to Egypt, to Malaysia, and to Turkey, for example. And so you have people living on mountains of garbage, of textiles, of very low quality, full of chemicals, very bad chemicals and textures like polyester that makes 200 years to disintegrate and then just creates very small polyester elements in the ocean, etc., etc. It's really an ecological nightmare. And when you register the pollutions, and when you register on the global scale who is polluting with these mountains of garbage, it will be Egypt, Malaysia, and Turkey in that specific example I'm giving, not Europe, because they have paid to receive this. Yeah, so there is a whole history of waste distribution that is completely key in that. And that's a little bit why I think it's interesting also to challenge this European common market as potentially massive greenwashing scheme, to be verified, but still it could be a good question to ask, because to see what do we cover, what do we register, record, and what do we externalize, and where do we put the bad figures to push it to other countries.
Well, thank you. If there are no other questions, then we can close this session. And for the kind of closing remarks, I will give over to Alexander and Peter, who would talk.
Yeah.
Floor is yours.
Well, I will start with Peter. Will conclude possibly. But yeah, I should say that I'm very happy with this discussion. That the idea was to launch this as a kind of pioneering thing. How we could, due to this new, not so new now, after COVID technology, we could really get together without much expense and talk to each other and see each other's face. And that was very, very positive experience, really. And I hope that at some point, maybe in a year from now, we could sort of reproduce it in sort of with a bigger audience and with more hardcore empirical results in hands, discussing our actual whatever article projects or book chapter projects and the data. And that would be wonderful if it continues and expands.
Okay, should I follow? Well, I haven't really much to add. I echo Alexander. I think this was a very rich meeting, limited to one day, but extremely rich and full within that day. I mean, I just can say Stefan was so kind mentioning my book on carbon societies, and indeed, something I've not been able to do because I didn't get funding for the research was to actually fully develop a world regionally comparative perspective. So from this meeting, I have indeed gained elements from Nigeria, Venezuela, from various world regions to enrich indeed this perspective. And I think this may be something Alexander made maybe the most explicit proposal with the carbon gender nexus, but one could develop several research lines which one can indeed fill empirically and comparatively across various world regions. I think there's a lot to do, including also, which would mean then, which I was trying to do in the morning, to reflect about the different positioning of different world regions with regard to production and extraction of hydrocarbons or of their consumption and the changes that happen. So I hope this is the beginning of what can be a very fruitful cooperation and an urgent one at that, since we deal with very urgent issues. So thanks very much, Alexander, for getting us together for all this. And indeed, I hope we continue.
Absolutely, and all of you are very welcome to Vienna. So come to our hub. Let's arrange you giving talks and taking part in our edited volumes or doing some kind of other contributions to our joint work. Bye now, and let's keep in touch.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thanks a lot to everyone.